Okay, I think I got it going now. Here's the first scene. This one's from The Matrix Reloaded.
Château Aubryon, 1959. Magnificent. And I love French wine. Like I love the French language. I have sampled every language. French is my favorite. Fantastic language. Especially to curse. Nom de Dieu, de putain de bordel de merde, de saloperie, de connard, d'enculé de ta mère. It's like wiping your ass with silk. I love it. You know why we are here. I am a trafficker of information. I know everything I can. The question is, do you know why you are here? We are looking for the keymaker. Oh yes, it is true. The keymaker, of course. But this is not the reason, this is not the why. The keymaker himself is very nature's means. It is not a man. So to look for him is to be looking for a means to do what? You know the answer to that question. But do you? You think you do, but you do not. You are here because you were sent here. You were told to come here and then you obeyed. It is, of course, a way of all things. You see, there is only one constant, one universal. It is the only real cause. Causality. Action, reaction, cause, and effect. Everything begins with choice. No, wrong. Choice is an illusion created between those with power and those without. Look there, at that woman. Like.
So the Merovingian in Matrix Reloaded denies free will and says that the only truth, real truth, is causation or causality. See similar things in the Adjustment Bureau, which the textbook discusses.
You don't have free will, David. You have the appearance of free will.
So we get two pop culture examples of movies that illustrate this problem of free will or the question of free will. And here's a thought experiment that raises the question as well. So normally if we were doing an in-person class, I'd have you all write up responses to this, but for our purposes, we'll just go through it here and you can pause the video and think about what your answer would be to it. So this one's Taylor's Ingenious Physiologist. And so there's a thought experiment about free will. We can suppose that an ingenious physiologist can induce in me any volition he pleases, any desire or willing, right? Simply by pushing various buttons on an instrument to which, let us suppose, I am attached by numerous wires. All the volitions I have in that situation are accordingly precisely the ones that he gives me. By pushing one button, he evokes in me the volition to raise my hand, and my hand, being unimpeded, raises in response to that volition. By pushing another, he induces the volition in me to kick, and my foot, being unimpeded, kicks in response to that volition. We can even suppose that the physiologist puts a rifle in my hands, aims it at some passerby, and then by pushing the proper button, evokes in me the volition to squeeze my finger against the trigger, and the passerby falls dead of a bullet wound. Does the shooter, and this person, the person holding the gun, in other words, have free will? So just pause the video here and think about how you would answer that question. All right, so I'm willing that in this scenario, many people would say that the individual with the gun in their hand doesn't really have free will because they're being controlled. All the desires they have are being controlled by some external stimulus, right? So a fairly common response to that kind of thought experiment here. And so nevertheless, we tend to think that we have free will, at least in some instances. And again, I'm talking about the capacity to do what we want, not whether governments restrict what we do, what we want. So that's the question of political freedom or moral freedom. The question here is a metaphysical one. So we got an apparent contradiction. On the one hand, I like to think that at least some of my actions are results of my own volition, my own free will, and that's not an illusion. But on the other hand, a lot of science seems to tell us that we're cogs in a machine in some way, right? So that gives rise to a problem. We have a contradiction here. We have a strong intuition that at least some of our actions are free, and that we have free will, at least in some instances. On the other hand, we have the denial of free will, right? A lot of evidence seems to say that, well, the way I behave or my choices are really just the results of antecedent factors beyond my control, my genes, my biology, socialization, that sort of stuff. And so we have an apparent contradiction here. And this is the problem of free will, that the difficulty of explaining how we act freely in any given instant, given standard accounts of causation, or that universal principle of causality, like the Merovingian was saying, or the law of cause and effect, if you want to call it that. Your textbook uses all that language to discuss this notion of determinism, that an event or an action all events or actions are caused by some factors antecedent and prior to them, but sufficient enough to bring them about. So we got three basic philosophical positions on free will. And of course, we're looking at some classic positions here, some historically influential positions, but not necessarily the most contemporary versions of all of these positions. Although with libertarianism, we'll look at some contemporary thinkers on that one, more contemporary thinkers on that one. So we've got hard determinism. That's the Merovingian's position, and the Adjustment Bureau's position. We have soft determinism or compatibilism, and then libertarianism. And again, here, libertarianism is not referring to a political view, but a metaphysical view about free will. And so most of you probably have some, at least initial intuitions about whether you have free will or not, or about this problem. This is a philosophical problem that lots of people tend to have opinions about anyway. And so hopefully that thought experiment got you thinking about what, if you don't have one, what your opinion might be already. So this has been a way of starting out. We're going to look at Baron de Holbach here, and he's an advocate. He was an 18th century advocate of hard determinism. But we need to keep in mind this distinction between determinism and hard determinism here. So determinism is just the dictum that every event or action is caused to occur, sometimes called the universal principle of causality, or the law of cause and effect, right? So it's also the view, or additionally, in addition to that, the view that what obtains in the future couldn't be different given what has obtained in the past. So that's where that notion of fatalism comes in there, right? So we've got this view that just determinism, that actions are caused, all events are caused to occur by some antecedent factors that are beyond our control, right? And then hard determinism is the view that determinism is true and that free will is an illusion. So let's look at de Holbach here, again, an 18th century thinker that advocated this view. And he claimed his basic idea is that all of our actions are caused, right, or determined, right, by our strongest desire. And the thing here is that we are not really picking our desires. They're just what's in us by nature. And so there's a reading selection in the textbook from Baron de Holbach. I won't go through all the quotes that I normally go through. I'll just pick out a couple here to mention. If you have time, you should do that additional reading from the primary source if you can. So he says that human beings are a part of the natural order. So he says, in whatever manner man is considered, he is connected to universal nature and submitted to the necessary and immutable, the unchanging laws of nature that nature, imposes on all beings she contains according to their peculiar essences or to their respective properties, without consulting them, she endows each particular species. So human beings have certain psychological traits that they don't pick, right? When you probably heard your parents tell you one time, you've been like blank or X ever since you were a baby, right? You've had this disposition ever since you were a baby, right? So he says, nevertheless, in despite of the shackles by which he is bound, it is pretended he is a free agent, or that independent of the causes by which he is moved, that he determines his own will, regulates his own condition. Right? And so causes here are what eliminate freedom in de Holbach's view. So he says, we always act on our strongest desire, and when he does not act on this impulse, it's because some new one comes up that's now the strongest desire. The new, stronger motive changes our direction, our actions. So he says, when he does not act according to this impulse, it's because there comes some new cause, some new motive, some new idea, which modifies his brain in a different manner to give him a new impulse and determines his will in another way. by which the action of the former impulse is suspended. Thus, the sight of an agreeable object or its idea determines his will to set him in action to procure it. So suppose I want to eat a piece of chocolate cake, but then all of a sudden, so I'm going to act on my strongest desire to have the chocolate cake, but then I see, oh, there's vanilla ice cream over here, and I like vanilla ice cream more than chocolate cake. So now that impulse is what's going to cause my new action. So a decision change, right, or a change of decision, a change of one's mind is really just caused by some stimulus, right? It's a necessary result of that stimulus that's causing my action. So he says, in short, the actions of man are never free. They're always the necessary consequence of his temperament, of the received ideas, and of the notions, either true or false, which he has formed of himself, of happiness, of his opinions, strengthened by example, by education, and by daily experience. So we've got just kind of our human nature as physical beings, and then some psychological conditioning, and then that's what's working together to cause our actions. So humankind is subject to his passions, to his desires. Man then is not a free agent in any one instant of his life. Notice how strong of a claim that is, any one instant. He's necessarily guided in each step by those advantages, whether real or fictitious, that he attaches to its objects by which his passions are aroused. These passions themselves are necessary in a being who unceasingly tends towards his own happiness. So there's a notion of free will at work in de Holbach's argument here. And he considers like a couple of different possibilities for what free action might look like. Maybe we should think of it as dispassionate action, right? As non-passionate action, as being impartial, and then making an impartial decision to go do something. Or we might think of freedom as the absence of external constraints on our behavior or conduct, either social constraints or a physical constraint. Or we might think of acting contrary to my initial inclinations as an act of freedom. But de Holbach denies each one of those. He says really that it's because we don't understand all the causes that are working on us that we mistakenly conclude that we have free will. So he said it is then for want of recurring to the causes that move him, for want of being able to analyze, from not being competent to decompose the complicated motion of his machine, that man believes himself a free agent. It's only upon his own ignorance that he founds the profound yet deceitful notion that he has free agency. So you could think of, updating some position like de Holbach and adding some biology, some genetics, some neuroscience, and saying, aha, my decision, my thought process are really just dictated by electrochemical impulses in the brain, and that's what's causing my actions. Although de Holbach was an 18th century thinker, and so the physics of the 18th century said the universe is like a big machine, and we're just cogs in that machine. That's basically what he's arguing. He just didn't have neuroscience to show us that, right? So he says, from whence it may be seen that the same necessity which regulates the physical world also regulates the moral world, in which everything is a consequence submitted to fatality. Man, in running over, frequently without his own knowledge, often in spite of himself, the route which nature has marked out for him, resembles a swimmer who is obliged to follow the current. So you should stop here and get some practice reconstructing arguments using those basic deductive argument forms that we looked at. So reconstruct what let's call this the strongest desire argument, de Holbach's strongest desire argument for hard determinism, which denies free will. And so one of the main premises in that argument is going to have to make use of this notion of the strongest desire causing our actions, and therefore lead to the denial of freedom. So pause here and get yourself some practice trying to formulate that argument, and then next I'll show you how I did it. All right, so hopefully you paused and got some practice doing that. Let's take a look at an argument now. So my first premise is going to be, if actions are caused by the strongest desire, then human beings do not have free will. Actions are caused by the strongest desire. That's what we just saw de Holbach arguing for. Thus, human beings do not have free will. So I've just reconstructed a basic argument for hard determinism here using that modus ponens form. And then a question that we always have to worry about is, does that argument contain any major errors of fact, fallacy, or self-contradiction, or maybe a false conditional, right? where the false conditional is false, but not because it violates the law of non-contradiction. We don't have to worry about any formal fallacies because we know that this is a modus ponens argument, so that's a valid form. We just have to worry about any informal fallacies, or again, one of these other errors. So that's de Holbach's basic argument for hard determinism. It's a classical argument for hard determinism. And then just to recap, here's some of the key ideas that were in that argument. We're always caused to act by our strongest desire, right? So de Holbach thinks that a free action, a free will, an act of free will would be an uncaused action. But since everything has a cause, there's no free will, right? So a lot of his argument depends both on his notion that we're always caused to act by our strongest desire, and then the way he conceives of a free action or free will is an uncaused action. So de Holbach, hard determinism, in de Holbach's view, is a form of incompatibilism. The idea that free will, uncaused action, is not compatible with the idea of the standard account of causation, right? So that looks like an argument, well, that is an argument against free will, that free will is an illusion. So the next position we'll look at is called compatibilism. So obviously there's going to be a difference between that position and de Holbach's hard determinism, which involves this incompatibilist view. All right, so that's a little bit about hard determinism. Be sure and think about those concepts that are operative in that argument before you move on to the compatibilist view, because the compatibilist is going to take some issue with both de Holbach's view of causation and his view of of free will as an uncaused action. So you're going to propose an alternative there to both of those. All right, so hope everybody's doing well, and be sure you check out the compatibilist lecture next.